particularly on a rather unpleasant night. And welcome to our third annual Reynolds Symposium on News Media and the Law. My name is Brian Richardson. I'm head of the Department of Journalism and Mass Communications here at Washington & Lee. I'm really excited and intrigued by our program today and tomorrow, and I invite you to participate in both with questions and your own observations. This symposium is a collaborative effort of the Department of Journalism and Mass Communications and the School of Law here at Washington & Lee, made possible by a generous grant from the Donald W. Reynolds Foundation. In a moment, I'll introduce our Reynolds Professor of Legal Journalism, Tony Losey, who will in turn introduce our distinguished panel. First, I'd like to extend my own heartfelt thanks to all of our panelists for agreeing to be with us today. It's not easy getting to Lexington under the best conditions. Braving the remnants of a hurricane to do so is laudable indeed. And as one of my colleagues said a few minutes ago, I guess we chose the right title in the perfect storm. We just didn't know how apt it would be. Anyway, we are deeply grateful to you all. I wish also to express my thanks to Professor Losey and to our Reynolds Programs Coordinator, John Muncy, for their tireless work in organizing this symposium, again, both this evening's event and tomorrow's. Tony Losey is a veteran journalist who has covered courts, the federal judicial system, the FBI, and the U.S. Supreme Court for the likes of the Washington Post, the Associated Press, USA Today, U.S. News and World Report, and the Boston Globe. But she is also an avid sports fan, and I was delighted when she proposed a topic for this year's symposium. Please join me in welcoming Professor Tony Losey.
We worked together at the Globe. I get the fun part, which is introducing our distinguished guests. First, our moderator, Rod Smolla, who is Dean of W&L's School of Law. Dean Smolla is the author of several books on the First Amendment. He also is a frequent commentator on legal disputes involving online media. Our first panelist is Jackie MacMullan, Jackie Mac to sports fans, a columnist and correspondent for ESPN, and the only woman I've seen on ESPN's Around the Horn show on a regular basis, and I'm a regular viewer. Ms. MacMullan began her career at the Boston Globe, where she covered everything from the World Series to the Stanley Cup Finals to Final Four tournaments. Her latest book, When the Game Was Ours, a collaboration with Boston Celtics great Larry Bird and Los Angeles Lakers star Magic Johnson, has created quite a stir with its revelations, among other things, about Johnson's feelings toward former Detroit Pistons player Isaiah Thomas, who questioned Johnson's sexuality after Johnson was diagnosed with HIV. Our next panelist is Larry Woodward. Mr. Woodward, a lawyer, represented pro football quarterback Michael Vick when he was accused of participating in an illegal dogfighting ring. Mr. Woodward also has represented such sports figures as basketball star Allen Iverson and NFL players D'Angelo Hall and Jason Snelling. Mr. Woodward, who is a member of a Virginia Beach law firm, is an accomplished criminal defense attorney who also handles death penalty cases. Our next panelist is Lee Hawkins. Mr. Hawkins is a reporter for the Wall Street Journal and an on-air contributor for CNBC. He hosted Newbos, The Rise of America's New Black Overclass, a primetime documentary released earlier this year. The documentary focused on how increased earnings affect black celebrities in sports, entertainment, and the media industries. He is also working on a book that will examine how this increase in wealth affects blacks in the context of race and class in America. Our final panelist is Christopher Lyons. Mr. Lyons is an attorney in Miami who represented former New York Giants Cleveland Browns receiver Donte Stallworth in civil and criminal cases that stemmed from a fatal DUI accident. Mr. Lyons negotiated a resolution in which Mr. Stallworth paid money to the family of the victim and also served 24 days in jail. Please join me in extending a warm Washington and Lee welcome to our guests.
I'm going to invite the four panelists to each give us some opening thoughts, and then I'm going to invite the audience to begin asking questions of the panelists. And I may have a question or two myself, either reacting to some of the questions that come from the audience or some of the remarks of the panelists. And so, Christopher, why don't we invite you to go first, and we'll just move right on down the line.
All right. Well, thanks, Dean, for inviting me, and Ms. Losey for all your considerations, and thanks for being here this evening. When I got the invitation a few weeks ago, immediately I was struck by the title, The Perfect Storm, the intersection of sports law and the media. And it immediately brought me back to the day that I was hired to represent Donte Stallworth, which coincidentally was the same day of the fatal accident. And I was in the living room of his very close friend, and many professional athletes, basketball players, football players, agents, his advisors, his family from California had all come in, and we're having a meeting about the case. And I'm being, firestormed with questions such as, is he going to go to jail for 15 years? Is he ever going to be able to play football again? What about his signing bonus? What about protecting his assets in a wrongful death lawsuit? What about his perception in the media and in the public? How are we going to handle that? And we spent about 8 hours that day and about 10 hours the next day trying to field all these questions and assuring them that we'll help them through that process. And at the end of it, they always want to know, what's the end game? What's the end of the rainbow? What's going to be the final result? And they want to know that on day one, even though it may take years to get there. They always want to know what's ultimately going to happen. And I remember looking Mr. Stallworth in the eyes and saying, we need a perfect storm to happen in this case for you to be able to stay out of jail, keep your assets, and hopefully one day play. So I think at least that was a good selection tonight to come here. But in any event, really that case really was a convergence of all those factors. Normally, handling a criminal case, and I used to be a prosecutor from the other side, but as a defense attorney, your role really is very limited, and you're just designed with the task of protecting your client's interest. Usually it involves keeping them out of jail or preserving their reputation. This case had so many different components to it, and really, it was overwhelming in the beginning because there were so many issues that were on the table right from day one. The media played a very significant role in this case. Many people after the fact, have said that Mr. Stallworth, like others, got preferential treatment because of his celebrity status, because of his wealth, because of his fame. I actually, vehemently disagree with that. It was actually harder because of all those factors. One of the things that when you have a case, I know Mr. Woodward's going to speak about this, when you're representing athletes or entertainers, actors, there's a spotlight on the case from the media point of view, both from, in this case, it was local and national. And so everything that you did was scrutinized. Every time you went to court to even have the most mundane hearing, 20 reporters would show up, and nothing was done, in the judge's chambers. Everything was done in the public, and people would report on what you did. From the prosecution point of view, they became very concerned about that, and from a public relations point of view, it was not good to have to deal with the negotiations of the case in a public forum. So what we tried to do was get a resolution to the criminal case and the civil case really within 90 days of the incident. And I think Ms. Wood will tell you that a wrongful death civil case could take 3 years before the case is resolved. You're dealing with insurance companies. You're dealing with a lot of lawyers. So there was a lot of things that we felt we had to do right away to get a resolution, because each day that went by, there were reports in the media of erroneous toxicology results. And there were blogs that were set up on all these sports sites. And people in the Cleveland Browns and the community, they wanted him off the team. They wanted the commissioner to suspend him. You had Mothers Against Drunk Driving coming out against him. And there was all these variables that were going on, kind of the perfect storm, and we knew we had to get this done. So we had a group of about 8 people working on the case with his family and his friends and agents, and every day we would text each other, perfect storm, perfect storm, perfect storm. And it's really true. And we knew that time was not going to help us because of the attention this case was getting. One of the things I will say, though, that was an advantage, and I'm not naive to think it wasn't, that money had a role. It certainly helped from day one having the resources that most people accused of a crime, a serious one, where someone is killed, may not have. And so that was beneficial to be able to have investigators and experts from day one helping us on the case, which was very interesting in this news cycle, 24-hour news cycle. Immediately the day of this accident, there were people coming down to the scene with their phones, taking pictures, and actually contemporaneously, as the police were detaining Mr. Stallworth, there were people on camera phones videotaping his field sobriety test. There were people videotaping, where Mr. Reyes, the deceased, body laid in the intersection, and where his vehicle was. And those types of things were very useful to the defense, that we actually had that footage, and that wouldn't be normally the case if someone wasn't, either a celebrity or a professional athlete. So in that sense, it really helped. The media helped us. One of the things that was difficult in the case, well, one other thing that did help, when we were trying to resolve the wrongful death civil suit, we're dealing with many different lawyers for the insurance companies, but the lead attorney that was representing the deceased, Mr. Reyes, I, like myself, am a Bostonian, and I knew that he was a Bostonian, and Jackie will tell you that we're diehard Red Sox and New England Patriots fans, so to a fault. And Donte Stallworth, 2 years earlier, the year the New England Patriots went undefeated and lost in the Super Bowl, Stallworth played for the Patriots. And so we were in the finals hours of negotiating the civil case, and we were real close to settling it. The next morning at 9 o'clock, they were going to file a lawsuit with a lot of inflammatory language and punitive damages and all kinds of things that we really didn't, the timing of which would have been terrible for us. And at about midnight the night before they were going to do that, we were very close on the monetary aspect of the case. And the lawyer representing Mr. Reyes said, if you can get me a signed, autographed New England Patriots jersey, we got a deal. And so it did help in that sense. Yeah.
Are you kidding?
No. And it had to be the authentic one from 2007. But that was really my aspect of it. The last part of it was after the case came out, the resolution, there was a lot of backlash against various people in the case. And, that was, on a personal level, we spent about a month trying to defend in the media the resolution to the case. And there was obviously a lot of comparisons with the Michael Vick case. And there was a lot of blogs that were set up in Cleveland where he played football. And there was a lot of, hate mail and emails that not only he received, I received, and other people. And so that aspect of it was unpleasant. But overall, we were able to get the perfect storm in about 90 days, and that's my take on the case.
Thanks, Christopher. Lee, how about going next?
Yeah, well, I think that when you really look at this underlying, the critical things here are at the center of the circle is the brand. The brand runs everything, and that has a direct impact on everything that athlete or that entertainer does from a business standpoint. And the circle is the sports, law, and the media. And when I say that, I'm really talking about the intersection as having a sports figure whose career success is determined by their legal decisions and the decisions that their team makes, and how those decisions and off-the-field decisions are reported and conveyed by the media. And what I've tried to do in all of my work is to really look at the business behind some of these people. For instance, LeBron James, we all know him as this powerful brand and one of the most recognizable figures in the sports world, but we know very little about the $100 million business behind LeBron James, and the fact that LeBron James has taken an equity stake in that business from a marketing standpoint and decided to appoint people that are close to him to run it. People think about Paris Hilton, but not necessarily the fact that she has a $100 million business every year in revenue, dealing with just her perfume business alone. Sean Combs has a $500 million business brand himself with his clothing line. But so what's at stake here? Well, all that business is at stake if there's any kind of diminishment in the brand equity of these people. And so when you think about a Michael Vick, or you think about a Donte Stallworth, or you think about the young lady from University of New Mexico right now, who's been suspended indefinitely, which I think is a double standard, a vicious double standard. But when you think about these people, the way that they manage this brand is going to have enormous impact over time. And the problem, specifically when I look at African American players, is that the sociological realities that they begin with before they go into the league stay with them when they go into the league. And so a lot of people don't necessarily have any kind of respect for the reality that we are dealing with a person. And so when you talked about how everybody's worried about the end result, it comes down to the money ultimately with almost all of these individuals, because this is a business. But when you have a person like a Chris Brown making the mistake that he made, there is no compassion for the idea of evolution and what it means to be able to have a brand that potentially would enable you to be someone in business that could be charitable, that could grow that business, and that could continue to make contributions to society in the same way that Magic Johnson has, in the same way that John Elway has, and all of these individuals that kind of evolve over their career and then their post-career to use the media and to use their brand in ways that really affect more than just themselves. So when I use Chris Brown as an example, because he got killed by the 24-hour news cycle. By the time that news hit, I think it was the weekend of the Grammys, by the time, within an hour, that news was all over the world. And the reality is, the way that he spent it by going on Larry King with his mother and trying his best to kind of repent for what he did, which was a horrific mistake and everything, he really should have been going on there talking about his plans to go to college, or his plans to become more enlightened, on the business side as an entertainer. And to talk about the fact that people that have evolved, for instance, Oprah Winfrey, someone who has, made enormous contributions to society. At one time, she experimented with drugs. Barack Obama experimented with drugs. Dick Cheney had 2 DUIs in 1 year when he was around the same age as Donte Stallworth. All of these people evolved, and they became great individuals in America. And so I think it's really about how you look at people, how they're viewed in the media, and how they're able to have the right people around them, basically, to spin and to shape that story. The problem with a lot of these athletes is that very few of them are prepared for the experience in itself. So you sit down with a young athlete, about 2/3 of them, as we know, are filing bankruptcy in the NFL, are filing bankruptcy within 3 years of leaving the game. And so what that says to me is they're not even thinking about the financial ramifications of their success. So they're certainly not able to think about how are we going to be able to build kind of a team behind this player to make sure that when the news does hit about the mistake that they made, we're going to be prepared for it. And I think we were talking earlier about how there are so many different people involved in the process, and everybody has different interests. Very few people are really skilled on the media side to really handle all of these different constituencies. And so that's the problem. And there's a final thing I'll say is I've tried my best to focus as well on some of the positive examples and how the 24-hour news cycle and branding and the proper use of business and legal affairs can be used to make someone have a long career. And two examples I'll give is Tiki Barber is one of them. He's a person who, if you really sit down and look at him, most people think, oh, you know, he's this guy, he leveraged his career into a job on the Today Show. But very few people know that he's building affordable housing by millions of dollars. And he also has a playground equipment company that's very viable and continues to grow. Another one is Myron Rolle. Myron Rolle is the guy from Florida State who took the Rhodes Scholarship and decided to delay 1 year in his entry into the NFL for 1 year. I've spent a lot of time with Myron Rolle, and I'll tell you that this is someone who, when he goes into the NFL, he's going to have this process down. He's going to understand that his brand affects every aspect that we're talking about right now, and the way that he's coming in the game with the Rhodes Scholarship. He's going to probably get all kinds of corporate endorsement. He's going to be the antithesis, unfortunately, to some of the people that we're talking about at a time in which the NFL is struggling with an image crisis. And so this is really the gist of the whole issue that we're talking about today.
Thanks, Lee. Let's keep the pattern of lawyer, journalist, and let's have Larry go next, and then we'll hear from Jackie.
As you know, my name is Larry Woodward, and I guess I bring a little bit different perspective. I practice down in Virginia Beach. Been close to 30 years now, and I've had the opportunity to represent probably 20 or so professional and Division I athletes that have been in trouble with the law, mostly criminal, every once in a while civil. And I think the experience from that's most relevant for this in terms of the press is how you manage relationships in cases. And in any criminal case, there's a number of relationships. You have a relationship with your client. You have to deal with a prosecutor. You have that relationship. You have witnesses. If you go to trial, you have a judge, you have a jury, and how successful you are is how well you can understand those relationships and manage and get those relationships favorable to your client. When you have a high-profile case, press-driven, media-driven, that's an additional relationship that exists within the case that you have to be able to manage and handle on behalf of your client. And I will tell you that I've had every, I think, experience that you can have with the press, with my clients, from helicopters following cars, people hiding in bushes, people pretending to be things other than reporters, people sending kids to my client's house to try to get them to come outside so their picture can be taken, and not at the expense of seeming cynical, but I've concluded that the relationship between the press and the criminal defense lawyer is always going to be one of tension in a criminal case. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be a productive relationship, but almost always in the criminal cases I handle, there's what your client did that the authorities know about, and there's probably what your client did that the authorities don't know about. I use the analogy sometimes a lot of criminal cases are like icebergs. There's 10% of them above the water, and there's 90% of them below the water. The press's job is to find out as much as they can about the case, and concurrently with that, find out as much as they can about your client. A lot of times your job is to make sure that they don't find you know, one of my passions besides practicing law is music. And as I was driving up here today, I was thinking about the relationship in my cases between the press and me, and what song might best capture that. And it's not a love song, I can tell you that. And with reference to, some of you may remember, how many people know who Bob Seger is? Okay, most of you. Well, in 1976, Bob Seger wrote a song called Night Moves. And one of the best lines, in my opinion, in Night Moves was, I used her, she used me, we neither one cared because we were both getting our share. And I think that probably sums up, in a lot of ways, the relationship between a criminal defense attorney and a press person in a high-profile case. I certainly have used the press to my advantage at times. I've given the press information. I've received information from the press that, you know, it sometimes is helpful, sometimes not. I will end with this in terms of receiving information from the press that is useful on a sort of a hopefully comical level. When Michael Vick's case was going on, one of the times we had to appear in federal court in Richmond, I got a call from a person who's actually a friend of mine, was also a reporter that was covering the case, and my cell phone rings and he says, hey, Woody, have you seen the information on the blog about what some protesters plan to do tomorrow when y'all come out of the courtroom? And I go, no, what are you talking about? He said, well, there's this blog where a certain group is encouraging their members to collect their dog feces, put it in plastic bags with water, and throw it at you guys when you walk out of the courthouse. And I said, well, I appreciate you giving me that heads up. So I get off the phone and I tell my wife. She said, well, what was that all about? And I told her what it was, and she said, well, what do you think you should do? And I said, well, two things come to mind. One is wear a dark suit, and two is let my co-counsel walk out of the courthouse first. But I really take your questions. I always come to these things, and I'm up here talking about what I think is important, and y'all are right there probably, so I'm going to let Jackie talk a minute, and then we'll take some questions.
Thanks, Larry. Jackie?
Well, I've never hidden any bushes, and I wish I could afford a helicopter. But Larry is correct. Everybody's correct. The perfect storm requires, and to me, for what I do, the perfect storm is these two cases, the Donte Stallworth case and the Michael Vick case, because we spent a lot of time talking about, well, how can a man kill another man and only get 24 days? And this guy, all he did was kill dogs. Well, talk about simplifying two incredibly complicated cases. It's not that simple. It was never that simple. And yet, that's what the court of public opinion was. And Lee mentions the 24-hour news cycle. We are all held hostage by the 24 news cycle now. It used to be, and it still should be, that you should get it right. Now it's you should get it first. And I could sit up here all day and list all the rusted judgments that have been made. And in the media, what does the media mean? Does that mean newspapers? Does that mean blogs? Because in my mind, a blog is different than a newspaper, quite different. What is the blog? Who is writing the blog? Who gives them the credentials to become a source? In this particular case that you gave, Larry, that was good information. That's credible information. But so oftentimes, blogs are opinion. And are they opinion based on fact? Are they opinions based on speaking with Mr. Woodward? Are they facts based on talking with Chris? That's what reporters do. So what's the difference between reporting and opinion? These are the kind of things journalists are dealing with every day now. And then journalists, we have our newspaper hats on, and then we take them off at 5 o'clock to put on our television analyst hat. And how is our role different in those two settings? And those are things that we're still evolving, we're still learning about. But the reason I mentioned the perfect storm of these two cases is because, and Chris, you didn't allude to it, but the Donte Stallworth case was a horrible, horrible, terrible mistake. I knew Donte pretty well when he was in New England. He was one of the most congenial players in the locker room. I don't know him. I wouldn't pretend that I would to say I knew him. But he has a very good reputation in the league among his colleagues and among the media and among other people. He made a really, really bad decision, horrible, horrible, tragic mistake that he has to live with for the rest of his life. But what people didn't want to see in that case was, and you can correct me at any time if I don't have it right, was the gentleman, Mr. Reyes, who certainly didn't deserve his fate, but he did run across the street in a place where he shouldn't have crossed. And so I believe, Chris, and again, correct me, the prosecution did not have an airtight case to convict, or they weren't comfortable with an airtight case to take Donte Stallworth to court and win a conviction.
Correct.
Correct. So that case was different. It wasn't just 24 days. They had to go through the due process, and they had concerns about how the due process would end up. So that kind of gets lost in the shuffle of this big rush to judgment, this big storm of how can this man get off after only 24 days? He killed another man. And so over here, my friend Larry, Michael Vick, dogfighting, the dogfighting became a whole debate in wake of Michael Vick's case. Dogfighting is an accepted subculture in many places, certainly not where I grew up. I was horrified by what Michael Vick did, especially because we had actual videotape of it, and because it was a repetitive action. It was something that Michael Vick did over a long period of time. So does that explain why Michael Vick went to jail for, and I have to apologize, I don't remember in the end how long he went for.
It ended up being 18 months.
18 months, that's a long time. That's a long time to be in prison. But there were other factors involved in that case. So how much does the media play a role in this? A huge role, and I'm glad Larry said what he did. We use them, and they use us, and I think the media in many ways crucified Michael Vick, and yet when he came out of prison, I think the media was his best friend because they gave him the opportunity to show himself as an incredibly remorseful person who wanted to turn his life around, who was going to volunteer with the people that had cruelty to animal organizations. He was going to go out there and work in the community and make a difference. And the media gave him that vehicle to go out and tell all you people all about that. And yet, I'm sure that the media, those helicopters and those people in the bushes and many of the other things that happened contributed to his lengthy prison sentence. So I guess I'll stop there. It's a very complicated media world because I don't even know what media means anymore. I'm just not really sure what it means. I know what I consider to be media, but maybe it isn't what you all consider to be media any longer.
Thanks, Jackie. I've been asked to repeat the questions that you ask, I think, for recording purposes. So the floor is open, and I'll do the best I can to listen and repeat them. Please.
I'm just curious how much of it impacts trials and outcomes of these players. Do you think these players' original reputation, the league, the public, the media, before they ever committed a crime?
So the question is, to what extent does the pre-existing reputation of the player impact what happens once there's a crisis and the criminal justice system intervenes and the media shines its spotlight? And I think any of the panelists might have ideas on that.
Well, I think it's significant, and I can tell you in the Stallworth case, what we did was, we were talking about this earlier, oftentimes when people get in trouble, from that point forward, they say, this is how I'm going to change my life, and this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go out in the community, and I'm going to volunteer at homeless shelters and do public service announcements for people that are, celebrities or sports figures. What was really significant, and the head prosecutor in Miami, when she gave a press conference about justifying the plea deal that we did, talked about his pre-incident mitigation. How did he lead his life prior to this tragedy? And it was overwhelmingly good. We were able to get, all types of character references all the way back to junior high school coaches, college coaches, talking about the community service, the donations he had done, not in the public domain, but privately behind the scenes. And we were able to document all that, and that really was significant because, unfortunately, what you do see in the criminal justice system is when people are in crisis, that's when they decide to change their life. And oftentimes it's kind of, shallow. It's not sincere. And in this case, it was really significant. And conversely, I've had clients who really have had a really troubled past, and so when you talk about this is what we're going to do in the future, it lacks credibility.
I think I tend to agree with that. I think one of the things that happens, though, is